people in. Okay, we have Michele Rosenberg, that he's a postdoc right now in Northwestern, and he recently graduated from Carlos III, and has broad interest in applied economics, but basically with the fields of economic history, development, and political economy. So every applied economics that you can think of. So today, Michele will talk about how the West was won, no? About the expansion of the U.S. economy to westward.
Yes.
So yes. I think that we can start right now. It's 2:05. So thank you, Michele. The floor is yours. And about an
hour.
Go ahead with
your. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
So hi everyone. So let me just start by saying that this is a joint work with Federico Masera, who also graduated from Carlos III, and he's now at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. So, all right, so the motivation for this work is the idea that slavery has been one of the most widespread and long-lasting labor institutions throughout human history. There are many examples that span from ancient civilization to the last and what we consider to be one of the most important cases, the US antebellum South. But by the end of the 19th century, slavery had become both economically marginal and morally unjustifiable. So the underlying question that is behind this paper is to try to understand what explains the demise of slavery during the 19th century. And if we look at the literature, there are two main views. On the one hand, the idea that humanitarian sentiments were a key element in the political defeat of slavery, pushing for an interpretation that stressed the role of ideological changes into institutional and economic changes. But on the other hand, several scholars, in particular Williams, have pointed out what has been called a curious affinity with the rise of this humanitarian sentiment and the development of new economic interest, pushing for an interpretation that goes from economic forces into institutional change and the defeat of slavery. So in this paper, we focus on this tension between the ideological interpretation and the economic interpretation of the changes for the political support for slavery. And we do this in the context of the US antebellum South in the period that goes from 1810 to 1860. Now, the reason we focus on the US South is not only because it is one of the most important cases of a slave society, but also because the specific institutional setting makes it particularly interesting from a political economic point of view. And this is because the US South was basically a democracy in which the large majority of the white male population had the right to vote, but at the same time, only a small minority of these white males owned slaves. And this is one of the reasons why most of the literature has focused on the ideological motives for the support for slavery in the US South. So we're going to try to see how economic forces played a role into the formation of a coalition that could support slavery, even for non-slave owners. And specifically, we're going to ask the question of whether changes in economic incentives to the use of slave labor affected the local political support for slavery. Now, there are three main challenges we face in this paper. The first one is to determine changes in economic incentives to the use of slave labor in itself. And we are going to do this by exploiting the process of the Westward Expansion, that is the expansion of the agricultural land available to the Southern economy during the movement of the frontier toward the West. The increase in this land and the change in the average quality of the land induced a shift in agricultural comparative advantage for the countries that were already part of the United States. And this, we're going to show, induced a process of slave relocation, which is going to determine a shift in economic incentives to the use of slave labor. The second point is going to be to measure the political support for slavery and its changes over time. We're going to do this basically by looking at the direct political support for slavery in Congress selecting those laws that were specifically about slavery. And then using these same laws, we are going to build two other measures to see how different parties voted, were standing with respect to slavery, and we are going to use this information to study presidential and gubernatorial elections in terms of popular votes. And finally, in the last section, we're going to try to understand the main channels behind the relationship between economic changes and this political transformation. We're going to first look at migration. We're going to try to estimate how much migration can explain this transformation. And then we're going to see whether we can see material changes in the incentives for the non-slave owning population to support slavery. And finally, we're going to have a section about the process of political persuasion and the change in the slavery debate. Okay, so I'm going to give you a preview of the findings. The first thing we show is that the slave owners were very responsive to economic incentives, and that our measure of changes in comparative advantage seems to be explaining about 80% of the entire process of slave relocation during this period. And we can also estimate how much was due to trade versus migration. This is an old debate in economic history. There are many estimates out there. Our analysis allows us to add a new one. The second point is to show that the Southern politics became increasingly divided over slavery. With respect to an average difference between the two Southern parties in the voting behavior on slavery of 10 percentage points during the entire period, we see that this difference doubled for the two most extreme congressional districts between 1810 and 1860. And then we show that these economic changes determine a shift in the support for slavery. In particular, the average effect for a county or a congressional district between 1810 and 1860 leads to a 10 to 15 percentage point drops in voting behavior for slavery. And we also show that secession strongly depended on the return for slavery. And we can show that, for example, one standard deviation change in the profitability of slavery at the local level could have changed completely the results for different states, potentially avoiding secession. And finally, we're going to show that one of the most plausible mechanisms through which this is happening is what we call the withdrawal of the planters' elite. So because the planters could move their assets, in particular slaves, across large spaces, shifting economic incentives made them change location, basically. And this opened up space for political change, but also drain out manufacturing capital, reducing investment, which is something that it is somewhat surprising with respect to what we think about slavery and economic development in general. Okay, so very briefly through the literature. The main literature we contribute to is the one on the political economy of slavery, and somehow also the more general literature on the role of elite in the process of institutional change and institutional persistence. There is a large literature, historical and qualitative literature on the political economy of slavery and what determined the support for the institution. In particular, this literature has stressed the role of ideology and the concept of hegemony in explaining why the poor white were so much in favor of slavery. Of course, they've been also talking about racism, but very little has been done in terms of looking at the economic determinants of the support for the institution. Yeah, please.
Just one question. You're talking that the slave owners were a minority in the southern states. I didn't know that, and you have just said that the poor white people supported slavery. How is the proportion of slave owners in southern states?
So, for example, in 1960, 25% of the households owned slaves, but basically 100% could vote. And you have that in the secession, the average, overall, it's about 70% support for secession. So you have more than the double of the slave owners that are voting in favor of slavery at a huge personal cost, because this is something that led to a war.
Yeah. And even though I was thinking about the linking, how many, although they were not slave owners, how their production depended on, there is no computation in input output. I don't know, that's far too much about how many people depending on the...
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think this is part of our contribution, in the sense that we don't know, or we didn't know as of now, what is the relationship between the production system with slave labor and the potential return from the non-slave owners at the local level. So, for example, what happened to wages, what happened to manufacturing sector, even in terms of structural transformation, we know very little about the relationship between the slave economy and the non-slave economy within the US South in the antebellum period. So exactly by trying to look at these elements, we're going to try to think about what could have supported slavery and induced the support for slavery for the non-slave owners.
Okay, thank you, Michele. Please.
So so this is one of the, I think, first paper that systematically look at voting behavior on slavery and how this is determined by economic changes. And the other literature I wanted to mention here is this literature on the role of elite in democracy and non-democracy. The main point, I think, is that most of the literature has focused on institutional persistence. And institutional persistence, in particular, thinking about I'm thinking about models of Acemoglu and Robinson, in which the elite tends to be a landowner elite that can capture the political system and avoid democratization or investment in manufacturing to support their own interests. While what we're showing here is that the specificity of the slave economy is such that the main assets that the elite owned was a mobile assets. And then in face of economic changes, they could remove their assets, and this led to this political transformation. Then, of course, there is a huge literature on the economic history of slavery. I think we there have a small contribution on the estimation of the importance of markets and migration in the process of slave relocation, but mainly what we bring there are new data and a new identification strategy to think about this change in the process of slave labor allocation. And finally, I'd like to mention the more general literature on the relationship between the economic and institutional transformation that we can think of it as starting at least from Douglas North. There are many papers thinking about the relationship between economic structure and institutional change. What we do here is to at least give one example, which is nevertheless important, which is the example of slavery, in which the economic structure has been determining the process of institutional transformation over time. All right, so if you don't have questions, I'm just gonna proceed with the historical context. After that, I will introduce the empirical strategy and the data, and then we're gonna see the three main sets of results. In the first one, We're going to briefly see how economic changes induce the slave relocation and agricultural transformation. In the second one, we're going to look at the political implication of this economic transformation. And finally, we're going to try to understand the mechanism, in particular looking at the role of wages, public goods, and newspaper. And in section 4, I will conclude. All right, so the main process we look at, as Carmelo said before, is this process of the westward expansion of the United States. So as you know, during the period that goes from 1810 to 1860, the US frontier moved toward the west. And this implied for the southern economy an increase in the populated land of about 3 times. And this was coupled with the shift of the epicenter of the production from the eastern shore to the Mississippi Valley. So this is what we mean by the westward expansion, and this is how we compute it. So the blue counties are the counties with more than 2 individuals per square kilometer. So this is what we consider, you can think of them as agriculturally active or populated enough to be part of our sample. The gray area is the rest of the United States, so it's the non-southern land, the one that is not part of our sample. And the yellow counties are the counties that eventually will be part of our sample as the frontier expand toward the west. So this is the populated area in 1810. This is how the expansion looks like decade by decade. So this is 1820, 30, then 40, 50, and finally 60. So what is important for us in this process of expansion is that cotton crop also expanded. So in 1810, cotton was only a secondary crop in the southern agricultural production system that was very concentrated in a few places in South Carolina and eastern Georgia, occupying only 10% of the slave labor force. But during the period that goes from 1810 to 1850, this cotton crop increased tenfold. And the share of the western states leaped from 7% to 64% in the production process. And eventually, in 1860, the slave population was occupied in cotton production by 70%, 75%. So this induced what we called the process of slave relocation. So because in 1807 the Atlantic slave trade was abolished, this implied that it was not legal to import any new slaves in the United States. And between 1810 and 1860, due to the westward expansion and the increase in cotton demand, the region's demand for slaves increased 20-fold. And this implied this movement of slaves from the east to the west that were estimated to be about 1 million people. So this is the slave distribution in 1810, where each dot represents 500 individuals. And this is, again, the same as slave distribution in 1860, where, again, each dot represents 500 individuals. So this is what we mean by this process of slave relocation. So to sum up, what we're looking at is a period in which there is this dramatic expansion of the land toward the west. The cotton production also moved toward the west, and slaves are following cotton production toward the west. So this is what really captures the idea of our empirical strategy. So let me quote Fogel on this. His demand for cotton grew relative to other southern commodities. Efficiency dictated a reallocation of labor and other resources to the best Western land. So this is exactly what we're going to exploit in our analysis to explain changes in economic incentives to the use of slave labor, and then look at the political implication of this process. All right, so briefly through the empirical strategy. Again, the idea is that the Westward Expansion changed the county's incentives to the use of slave labor depending on their productivity of cotton with respect to other crops. So our strategy exploits the Westward Expansion as a time variation. We're going to use an estimate of the changes in comparative advantage induced by the Westward Expansion to predict the movement of slaves and political change. So the way we do it is by first measuring a county relative productivity of cotton with respect to wheat in a given cross-section. So we have information from the FAO on the characteristics of the land at the county level. We know the boundaries through the census of the different counties, and we can compute this measure of relative productivity that is telling us how good a county is for the production of cotton with respect to wheat. We are using wheat in this case because it was the most sizable non-slave crop in the US South. This is something we can discuss if you want, but our analysis is robust to different type of baseline measure. And then we use the expansion of this, the best cotton for land as the frontier moved toward the west as a way to shift the comparative advantage of each county. So we compare each county relative productivity to all the other inhabited counties for any given census year. So let me give you a graphical representation of the change in the quality of the land for the production of cotton over time. So this is the distribution of relative productivity plotted for both the counties that were already inhabited in 1810 and the counties that were added in the period between 1810 and 1820. And on the x-axis, we have relative productivity, where 0 means that it is impossible to produce cotton, and as you move toward 1.5, you become much better in the production of cotton. So what we see here is that the red distribution, the one that represents the county that were added between 1810 and 1820, dominates the distribution of 1810. And this is true for each decade. So this implies that all the land that was added between 1810 and 1860 was systematically better than the land that was already there in the production of cotton with respect to wheat. So we are going to use this variation in the following way. So this is going to allow us to measure changes in the comparative advantage in the production of cotton by looking at the shift in the county's position in the distribution of relative productivity. So we look at the size of the inhabited southern land that is better than any given county I in terms of relative productivity. And this is giving us this, our main variable, which is land rank. This is going to be changing for each county I at each census year T, and is given by the sum from 1 to capital NT, that where capital NT is the total number of counties in a given census year, of the area of any county that is more productive than county I. So this is the size of the counties that are out there that are better in the production of cotton. So in the paper, we use a very small model to show that under the assumption that higher relative productivity implies a higher value for slaves, then an increase in land rank for a given county should lead to a drop in the number of slaves and in cotton production. And the intuition is that a higher land rank for a given county implies a higher number of better counties than you, which is a measure of the exposure to competition in the production of cotton. So let me very quickly show you the time variation that we are exploiting. This is the evolution of the quantiles of the share of land in terms of relative productivity over time. So in the first 5 bars, we have the land in 1810. That is, of course, each quantile is represent 20% of the total land. And then for each other decade, we look at how much the 1810 land represents of each quantile. And what you see is that the quantile that became least represented is the first quantile, the one that has the best land. And by 1860, the one that is clearly overrepresented is the fifth and the fourth quantile. So this is the type of variation that we are looking at. One way to visualize these results, or at least the relationship between land rank and slave distribution, is the following. So here I'm plotting the top 200 counties in terms of the share of slaves in 1810, and the top 200 counties in terms of land rank in 1810. And if we do the same in 1860, this is how the picture looks like. So again, this is the top 200 counties in terms of the share of the slave population at the county level in 1860, and the top 200 counties in terms of land rank, again, in 1860. So this is really the type of analysis that we are looking at. So how changes in land rank is going to affect changes in the share of slaves, and then try to study the political implications of this. So, of course, this is just a graphical representation. Now, the model we estimate is a non-balanced panel data model in which we have county and year fixed effect. So the main variable of interest is land rank that changes over time and space, and then we are going to include the year fixed effect times the region fixed effect, and the year fixed effect times the distance from the north. So for the sake of time, let me maybe skip the discussion of the results on slave labor allocation and agricultural change that is very much already captured in the graph I showed you before, and maybe go directly to the political implications of these economic changes, unless you have questions about the previous section. All right, so let me move to the political implications of these economic changes. Now, the first problem to try to understand the political implications of economic changes is to measure the political support for slavery. And this is something that at least is not trivial, in the sense that most of the historical analysis, or at least good part of the historical analysis, has converged on the idea that there was no much difference within the South on their political support for slavery. The idea was that the party system was fully dominated by the slave owners, and that racism and widespread pro-slavery ideology among the white population, even the poor white population, made the system fully supportive for slavery. So we start to dig into this by looking at the congressional votes between 1810 and 1860, and we select the 222 laws on slavery that exist. And this, by coding each of these laws into either pro-slavery or against slavery, we obtain a measure at the congressional district level of the support for slavery over time. And this is going to be, if you want, the core of our political analysis. But also, using this measure, we are going to be able to construct a measure at the party level. So we can look at how congressmen elected into one party or another party voted with respect to slavery, and know whether one party was more in favor of slavery or not. So, for example, throughout the analysis, we're going to use the fact that the Democratic Party was more systematically voting in favor of slavery with respect to the other party. So this is a representation of the party voting on these slave laws during the period that goes from 1810 to 1860. Now, the parties have changed during this period. So the first two dots represent what is called the first party system, the period that goes from 1810 to 1826. There are few laws about slavery during this period. And the two main parties are the Republican Democrats and the Federalist Party. So here I'm showing that there is no difference on slavery between these two parties within the South. During the period that goes from 1828 to 1836, we have that the parliament is represented by two main factions, the Jacksonian supporting President Andrew Jackson elected in 1828, and the anti-Jacksonian between the period up to 1836. So this instead were voting systematically differently, and the difference was about 10 percentage points. And this difference remained in the subsequent period, in which we have the Whig and the Democrat as the main parties. So using this pro-slavery vote by party, we're gonna be able to study popular voting behavior in the elections, studying changes in the share of votes in support for the Democratic Party or the Whig, the Jacksonian Party. These are going to be measures that we have at the county level. And finally, again, based on the notion that the Democratic and Jacksonian Party were the most pro-slavery, we're going to be able to look at how congressmen align to the political position of the different parties over time. And we are going to do that by using the DW nominate score, which is a simple way to synthesize the political position of a member of Congress using their entire history of voting in Congress. So basically, this is going to be a measure that tells us how much more in line you are with the Democratic Party with respect to your other fellow party member. And this is something that we can also do, keeping fixed the party you're coming from. Okay, and then the last measure that we use is the vote in the secession convention. Now, the vote in the secession convention, unfortunately, is something that we cannot exploit in terms of the change over time, because it only happens in 1860, 1861, depending on the state. But it is important for us because it allows us to corroborate the relation between land rank and the support for slavery in general. But also, I think it's important because it allows me to make, again, the point I tried to make at the beginning. That is, it is not obvious at all that the poor non-slave owners, white, should have voted in favor of slavery. And I think that the vote in the case of secession really makes the case strongly. So this is the relationship between land rank and the share of votes in favor of secession. There is a very clear and neat relationship. So here land rank is standardized to be 0 in its mean. 2 is are the worst places for cotton production, and -2 are the best places for cotton production in the country in 1860. And this is the share of votes in favor of secession. And I think it's really impressive to see how about 80–90% of the population, even in the face of a very strong concentration of slave ownership, in particular in those places that were particularly good for the production of cotton, actually voted in favor of secession, which implied basically going to war with the North and incurring in huge personal costs. So this picture, I think, is one of the reasons why most of the literature has talked about racism and widespread ideological motives in the South for supporting slavery. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of an idea of the type of political positions that were present in the South during this period. So these are just a couple of quotes that I think well represent the political spectrum. So this is the first quote is from Vice President Calhoun, Senator of South Carolina, that is addressing Congress in 1838, saying that, so he was one of the most important theorists of what is known as the positive good theory, the idea that slavery was a good in itself. So he says, many in the South once believed that slavery was a moral and political evil, but now such folly and delusions are gone, while slavery is recognized as the most safe and stable basis for free institutions in the world. So this is one view, and the other views, I mean, here I have other two views, let's say. But the idea is that both of them goes under what I would call the theory of slavery as an evil or even as a necessary evil. So the necessary evil concept is something that was there since at least Jefferson, who has famously talked about slavery as a necessary evil, with the idea that they were carrying the wolf by the ears, in the sense that full emancipation would have destroyed the Union, but they recognized that slavery was an evil. For Jefferson, necessary; for somebody else, not necessary. But still, here we are in Virginia in 1831, right after one of the most important slave revolt in the South, the Nat Turner Revolt, that led to a very open debate on the opportunity to emancipate the slaves in Virginia. And this debate was held in the House of Delegates during this so-called Virginia slavery debate. So this is one of the petitions that was sent to the House of Delegates in favor of emancipation, but with the idea in mind of the removal of the entire colored population from Virginia. So this is, I think, the idea is representing the idea that slavery was an evil mainly on racial basis, in the sense that they didn't want slavery, but they didn't want to have Black people around at all. And this, I think, is the most common of the anti-slavery position within the South in this period. And the second quote is from a delegate to the House of Virginia, saying that slavery is an evil because it is responsible for the decay of our prosperity and the retrograde movement of this once flourishing Commonwealth. So he's stressing the economic elements that, at least according to him, in Virginia were relating slavery to the downgrade of the position of the state. So we try to capture this type of variation by looking at the congressional votes. So these are all the votes, the categories of the votes we called. We have 220 votes in total, and the average pro-slavery vote is about 70%. So in total is 71% of the congressmen in the South vote in favor of slavery, but the standard deviation is very high. So there is a lot of variation that we can exploit here. All right, so let me show you the main results in politics, and then we can move to the mechanism section. So here we have three sets of results. The first two columns are about the pro-slavery vote. So this is how changes in land rank at the congressional district level affect the probability of voting in favor of slavery for a given congressional representative. The first column is clustering at the vote level. The second column is clustering at the district level. It is unclear what is the right clustering structure, so I'm reporting both of them. But the bottom line here is that the average change for the district between 1810 and 1860 led to a drop in 13 percentage point in the voting behavior in favor of slavery. We then move to column 3 and 4 to look at the share of the Democratic or Jacksonian Party between 1828 and 1860 in the presidential and gubernatorial election. So these are measures that are at the county level. And again, we have a change, an induced change by an average change of land rank at the county level that is about 10 percentage point. And finally, the DW nominee score is telling us that congressmen elected in a given district that had an average change in land rank between 1810 and 1860 moved 10 percentage point more closer to the average position of the Democratic Party. And this is both if we control for times party times the period, the time fixed effect, or if we don't. So it is really not much a matter of which party you were in, but is more how economically your district is doing with respect to slavery. That is determining your support for the institution. So to sum up, we show that average changes in land rank between 1810 and 1860 led politicians to move away from slavery politics by almost 14 percentage points, reduced politicians' alignment with the Democratic Party, and reduced the popular votes for the Democratic Party. Now, what the most interesting part of the analysis is to try to understand why this is happening. And this brings me to the last section about the mechanism. So we have three main stories in mind. If you have others, please let me know. The first one is the idea that this is basically a mechanical result of the movement of people. So because slave owners were migrating to places that where slavery was more profitable, then you can imagine that moving or changing the composition of the local population could immediately and mechanically affect the political equilibrium without the need of anyone changing their political behavior. So what we are going to do later is to try to estimate how much of the total effect we observe in the change in the support for the Democratic Party can be explained by this mechanism. I don't think I'm going to have to just give you an idea of what we find. So the average, the upper bound of the estimates is in fact 30%. So it seems that 30% can be directly explained by movement of slave owners. 70% should be explained by some form of indirect change in the political equilibrium at the local level. The second channel through which this can be happening is this slave owner strategic change in voting behavior. So you have a reorientation of investment, you sell your slaves, and then you change the political support. So this is something that may well be the case, but again, this would be only including slave owners who changed their behavior. While we know that the majority of the population was not slave owning, so there has to be, or there may be, some changes in the economic condition that led to the change in the non-slave owners' behavior. And in particular, we have in mind a story in which the decline of the planters' elite decreased the incentives to support slavery for the non-slave owning population. We have two main stories in mind. One is more about material incentives. You have to think about the Southern society as a society in which the slave owners class was strongly dominating political activity, was using coercion to control the ballots, but was also using public good provision and direct transfer, basically, to their employees as a way to maintain the political and economic control of the situation. And a decline of the planters' class may have induced a change in the material incentives to support slavery for the non-slave owning population. And finally, also changes in the non-material incentives. So we are going to try to think about changes in political persuasion and political propaganda by looking at newspapers' reaction to these economic changes. So let me first show you what I mean by these material incentives for non-slave owners to support slavery. And here we can show only in levels, but this is something that it is nevertheless important, that counties where there were plantations, so the best counties in terms of cotton production, had a higher level of public goods. So these are data from 1850. This is the size of the investment in education, public school, books in libraries, and the share of white literacy as a function of land rank. We consistently find that these places were better off in terms of public goods. Something that is surprising and we didn't know is that manufacturing occupations are also much more present in places with very low land rank. So the best places in terms of cotton production, the ones with plantation and large slave owners, are the places that receive the highest investment in manufacturing. So this is the manufacturing workers over the white population. And this is the manufacturing workers over the total population, even including slaves. So this is really not only about specialization of white people outside of the farming sector. And finally,
just one question. Regarding this evolution of the manufacturing sector, are you meaning that, for instance, in Maryland, that I see that there's a movement from slaves from Maryland to Louisiana or to the south? You meaning that what has substituted I guess that the area of Maryland to the east of the south, okay, then became less industrialized, or just meaning that?
So what I'm showing here is only levels.
Yeah.
So what I'm showing is a comparison between Maryland and Atlanta.
Okay. And
I'm showing that Maryland, despite the fact that I think in the common, like by common sense, we would imagine Maryland be more industrialized than Atlanta. It was not the case. Atlanta was more industrialized, and the likely reason is that Atlanta planters had much more money and they were investing heavily. So the manufacturing sector in the U.S. South was tiny. So we're not talking about huge manufacturing enterprises, but there was more manufacturing in general. So I think was very small in Maryland, was something more in Atlanta.
Okay, thank you.
The last part is the one related to wages. So these are data from the social statistics that we recently digitized, and this is also something that we didn't know before, and is the relationship between the wages for the white population and the presence of slaves. So again, we are looking at the relationship between land rank, and these are domestic servant daily wages. There's a very clear relationship that shows that plantation counties were paying more both for domestic servant and for farm laborers, but it's also true, I'm not showing it here, it's in the paper, but it's also true in the case of carpenters and common laborers. Okay, so this is in level. It's just a way to see, okay, people in these plantation counties, white people in these plantation counties were better off. But what about the change over time? So can we make a causal statement on the change in economic incentives to the support for slavery? And this is what we try to do here. So here we are looking at the effect of land rank on several of these variables. So in the first two columns, I'm showing the withdrawal of the planters. So there's a huge drain of planters when there is an increase in land rank. There is a decline in investment in manufacturing. There is even a decline in urban population, most likely because when planters move away, there is more free land, free in the sense that more land that can be purchased and occupied by poor white people that then move to the countryside for farming. There is a decline in the share of improved acres, testifying a decline in the quantity of labor that was put into agriculture. There is a decline in the wage of farm laborer and a decline in the wage of domestic servant, which really goes in the direction of thinking about the relationship, the complementarity between slave labor and the poor white. And there is an increase in the use of farm equipment, which is also an indication of the substitutions between slave labor and some material equipment. And finally, we show that there is a large increase in the turnout, both in the presidential election and in the gubernatorial election, which is what we mean by an increase in political participation. And this, I think, is the result of the fact that the planters were really controlling the ballots by the use of coercion. But once the planters move away, then the political environment is more inclusive, in a sense. And finally, we see an inflow of white people probably going to, for the opportunity of the free space in the countryside, and also of the free black population, which for us is an indication of potentially changes in social norm and the condition of the free black population. Okay, so to summarize, I think what we show here is that the decline of the slave-based economy induced a withdrawal of the planters' elite, a reduction in wages and manufacturing investment, and an increase in political participation and free black population that can be interpreted as a change in the material incentives for the non-slave owners to support slavery. This leads me to the last section of the paper, in which we ask what was the role of non-material incentives. In particular, we're going to try to look at the role of the political debate on slavery. And the way we do this is by looking at newspapers' behavior. So newspapers are a mirror of political change, in our view. And the way to try to understand how to use newspaper is to ask how different newspapers reacted to the same economic change. So we basically built a small model that is based on Gensco and Shapiro 2010, in which newspapers reflect local ideology. These newspapers, they have fixed partisanship, so they're going to be either affiliated to the Democratic Party, for example, or the Whig Party. But they're going to be able to choose their topic coverage. So they're going to be able to choose how much they talk about slavery, how much they talk about abolition. But if they talk about slavery and if they talk about abolition, they're going to do it consistently with their partisanship. So in our model, what we do is to is to see the effect, the comparative statistics of land rank on the slavery coverage of newspapers that are related to either the most pro-slavery section or the other section. So again, the idea is that if there is a decline in the economic condition that favors slavery at the local level, then we expect that the most pro-slavery newspapers will talk less about slavery. While if there is a decline in the pro-slavery, in the economic base, in the slavery-based economy at the local level, Whig newspapers or abolitionist newspapers are going to talk much more about slavery, saying, you see, we should abolish slavery, we should go for emancipation. So this is the main prediction of the model. So to test the model, we collect data for 90,000 issues and 280 newspapers that were active during this period. We code them into pro-slavery and non-pro-slavery, mainly looking at their political affiliation. So this is going to be Whig newspapers or anti-Jacksonian newspaper versus Democratic or other affiliated newspapers. And we're going to look first at outcomes related to how much these newspapers were talking about slavery. So these are essentially frequency of slavery-related words. So let me show you just the, oh, sorry. All right, so let me show you the model we made. So this is, in principle, is the same model as before, in which we have land rank as a main variable. Now, instead of being at the county level, it is at the circulation level, which is the area that on average was covered by a given newspaper. We still have time fixed effect. We have the interaction terms between region and year fixed effect, and distance from the north and year fixed effect captured by capital X. The new terms here are beta 2 and beta 3, in which we only interact land rank with a dummy that indicates whether the newspaper was affiliated to the pro-slavery party or to the non-pro-slavery party. And the reason is because we want to see what is the effect of land rank by on newspapers' behavior by party of affiliation. And to do that, we're going to have to look at the sum between the coefficient 1 and beta 2. So this is the sum here is what is capturing the average effect of land rank on the pro-slavery newspaper, and the sum of beta 1 plus beta 3 is capturing the average effect of land rank on other affiliated newspapers. So we have divided the slavery-related wars into three main categories: abolition and emancipation, fugitive and runaway, and slavery in general. And then this is the column that puts all these words together. And what we see here is that pro-slavery newspapers, when exposed to a decline in the local economic condition that favors slavery, decrease how much they're talking about slavery for all the slavery-related words, and while the opposite happens for newspapers that are affiliated to the other parties. In the last two columns, we show a couple of placebo. We have a few more in the paper, but essentially here the idea is just to show that this is only happening for what concerns slavery-related wars and not for other wars. In terms of quantification, we are talking about here a drop of 60% in the slavery-related wars between 1810 and 1860 for newspapers affiliated to the pro-slavery party. All right. So how do we interpret these results? I think there are two main stories. One is the idea that elite capture newspapers, in the sense that newspapers were controlled by local elite, and then changes in the elite composition determine changes in the political agenda. So this goes into the direction of thinking about non-material incentives for the non-slave owning population to vote in favor of slavery. So this is something we can think of as persuasion. But another interpretation is that this is reflecting some ideological change at the local level. So if we make the assumption, as in the case of Gensler and Shapiro, that newspapers reflect local ideology, in the sense that newspapers want to minimize the distance between their own ideological slant and the local readers' ideology, then we may think that changes in economic conditions are determining changes in the reader's political view, not only in their strategic political behavior, but something that goes a little bit more deeper than that. All right, so let me conclude. Yeah.
No, it's right time. Perfect.
Okay, so let me conclude with summarizing what I think we've found in this paper. So the first point is, again, that changes in agricultural comparative advantage explains the relocation of about 800,000 slaves between 1810 and 1860. That the average change in economic condition led to a drop in the support for slavery of about 10 to 15 percentage points. We also show that migration explains up to 70% of the slave movement, but only 30% of the political change, opening up spaces for the interpretation of different potential mechanisms. And finally, we show that the diffuse benefits from slavery to the non-slave owners population were potentially what explained this widespread support for the institution in the US South. And the bottom line of the paper is that the local profitability of the institutions determine its local political support.
Okay. Is there any question? I thank you, Michele. I have a question regarding your point is that there's a migration, that the slaves move from different areas depending on and they always move to the areas, the slave owners and the slaves, to the areas that eventually have a higher, lower land rank. Okay, that's the point.
Yeah.
The point is, but what is why there are some technical why in the early century the Maryland had a high land rank, low land rank, and then it was lower, and therefore the people the slaves moved to the Louisiana or the like. So is there any technological change, or is just the availability of new land in?
No, it's exactly. So it's so if you compare Maryland to Virginia, for example, let's say, Maryland is worse than Virginia in terms of cotton production.
Sure.
So land rank is going to be high in Maryland and lower in Virginia. But then if you add Texas is better than both Maryland and Virginia. So what is happening is that if Virginia had low land rank, now the land rank is increasing. So this is how the change over time.
It's just the movement of the frontier with the purchase of Louisiana.
Exactly.
Okay. And just one other question: what about the immigration from Europe? Okay, it happens at the same time. Okay, what happens? So they get into the West through New York and they stay north, or They
The
should have
majority,
economy, or
I don't have the numbers, but the majority, yeah, I don't have the numbers. I cannot guess, but the large majority of the European were in the north.
Okay.
Migration in the south was a tiny phenomenon. And in any case, the big wave is right after the Irish famine. So we are talking about the 50s. Is the moment in which the biggest wave is is taking place. But yeah, they're mostly going to New York.
I think.
And then, yeah.
There is a question.
Carmela, Lourdes.
Yeah, go ahead, go please, because I don't know.
Michele, is a very interesting paper. You have to work a lot with the newspaper, with all the news. It's just, I was reading just the summer a book about the Humboldt. It's a biography, and there is a chapter where Humboldt, who knew Jefferson in the United States, discussed about a slave system because Humboldt is against it. And Jefferson was basically an agricultural man. And because he's really interested in the benefits of agriculture, he supports a slave system, you know. And in this chapter, which is quite interesting, supports completely the result of your article, you know, that economic explanation about this support of the slave system, you know. It's just, I remember this chapter because it's like they obtain the same result as in your articles, you know. It's
great. Can you send me the reference of this chapter?
You can find it in the chat.
The book, I can send you the chapter, but it's a chapter just speaking Humboldt and Jefferson, and it's quite interesting because support all your ideas, you know.
Yeah, great. I'm gonna, if you send it to me, I'm gonna read it. Thanks a lot.
No, doesn't matter. It's a quite interesting paper. Your paper, you know.
Thank you.
The reference, Michele, I am Juan Angel, and just Lourdes put the reference on the chat to the book, I think. No,
I have
Lourdes?
to send the reference by email, Michele.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I assume that it will be in English also, you know. I read the book in Spanish. But
thank you.
You're welcome.
The link works, okay? I hope it works. Okay. Okay. Is there any other question? I think. Okay. Okay. Just another. I have another question regarding. Do you have evidence of that? Basically, the slave owners moved with the slaves to the southern states, or they just sold the slaves to another owner, and they. No, the point is that. If the slave owners sell their slaves and they stay and keep the benefits of the sale, and they could develop the basic idea that I think that is behind that you have presented is that, well, slave counties were more developed, so the people who live in the counties that had more slaves supported slavery, okay? But because they became more or less richer or wealthier because they have some kind of spillovers, okay?
Yeah.
The point is that if some slave owners sold the slaves to other plantation, instead of moving to south,
yeah.
they just sell the slaves, and they keep being rich and investing in the same country than before. It could be like a counterfactual, whether they support because there is just slavery because it's the economy depending completely on them, or they support slavery because they are ideological or stuff. Okay, my point.
Yeah. No, Exactly. So I think one of the potentially most interesting part of the paper, but it's something that we cannot really tackle. But the idea is that if you are willing to make the argument that, so to push the argument a little bit further, what you can say is that if it is the case that the movement of the slave owners cannot fully explain the political change, then it might be the case that not only changes in the economic incentives for the non-slave owning population affected their voting behavior from a strategic point of view, but also that economic changes induced an ideological transformation. And this may be, for example, the case of slave owners who sold their slaves. Now they don't have any reason to support anymore, and they start to think about the fact that slavery maybe is not as justifiable as it was for their parents, for example, because here, of course, we are talking about 1 or 2 generations change. And this can also affect social norms at the local level, no? So because the reduction of the quantity of slaves at the local level is a signal of the average of the distribution of beliefs about how people think about the institution, then people make also inference about what is their correct belief, and social norms may tend to one direction or the other. And this is maybe something that we can think of it as captured by the changes in the local free black population. So that more free black population is an indication of some changes in the social norm. So here I just wanted to show you, I think this is what you asked, no? How do we look at the change in the slave owning household? So this is because we have data at the household level for the period that goes between 1810 and 1840. The Jacksonian, so here, because also the Jacksonian Democratic Party are only active from 1824, so we can only look at the change between 1830 and 1840. And what we are doing here is to see that there is a drop associated to a change in land rank of 10 percentage points in the share of slave owning household at the local level. So these are households that either move or sell all their slaves. And the change in the support for the Democratic Party is about 36 percentage points. So, I mean, there's no need to go through the calculation. It's very simple here, even without the assumption. It's just this is 1/3 of this number, and the idea that we have in mind is that it means that if all these people moved or they all changed their mind because they sold their slaves, either ways, then they still can explain only 30% of the effect, and then the rest of the effect may be related to what you were suggesting. So changes in ideology.
Okay, thank you very much. It's quite clear. We still have time for one more question. Okay, not okay. Okay, thank you very much, Michele. I think I will ask everybody to open your mics and let's finish this seminar, clapping and thanking Michele.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Cap your enthusiasm. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Michele. It was a very nice.
Thank you for having me.
I hope that is going to be helpful for you can get good comments, okay? And I like very much it took me a time to realize that the idea of the moving westward everything was relative, okay? I was lost and I didn't realize that the problem with the productivity change was only relative to the
right thing.
For another, okay, very clear, okay? I like it very much.